Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more Hemi-Sync podcasts, such as Episode 8 with Dean Radin, podcasts that aren't necessarily associated with any particular Hemi-Sync product, but simply feature fascinating guests and subjects associated with the frontiers of consciousness research and understanding, please consider joining our exclusive Patreon page and get some great discounts on Hemi-Sync products in the bargain. Thanks for watching. So Mark, thanks for joining us. Your new book's called An End to Upside Down Thinking. Highly encourage you folks to go out and get it. I guess, I kind of came to your attention because of the pods I had done with Dean Radin and Bernardo Kastrup, two guys that you reference pretty extensively in the book. And you have kind of combined a lot of evidence in support of this idea of of idealism, which is in contrast to kind of the prevailing orthodox view of materialism, which is that holds that consciousness comes from matter, and compiled it all in one place. And some of this information I've seen before, some of it I haven't, but you've put it together in a way that I think is really accessible for an average lay reader, while retaining a lot of analytical rigor, which I would expect from you. And so just want to kind of to start, just kind of understand sort of your personal story a bit, because as I understand it, your worldview was kind of changed pretty rapidly in the last couple of years, right? Having been introduced to the science that has changed your mind about how reality works.
Yeah, so my background, typically when people hear what I do, they wonder how I became involved in consciousness.
Yeah.
I'm a partner at a firm in Silicon Valley called Sherpa Technology Group, and we advise technology companies on their business strategy and on transactions. Prior to my current role, I was with UBS in New York doing investment banking during the financial crisis. And prior to that, I was at Princeton, where I was captain of the tennis team. But back in college, I actually had an interest in astrophysics and decided not to major in it because I was busy with tennis and I just couldn't have done both. So I had big questions a while ago, but they were brushed aside. And what I thought the science was teaching me was that life has no meaning because consciousness comes from our brain, and when our body dies, that's it. Our memories are gone. So it's very difficult to come up with meaning in life without really rationalizing it. And so I understood that and just thought that's the way things were. But it was about 2 years ago that things shifted for me for the first time, where initially it was just podcasts that I heard where people were describing things that one might call paranormal, like communicating with the deceased or psychic abilities or working with energies that I wasn't familiar with. And I didn't take it seriously at first. But after hearing independent accounts, I began to wonder if something was up. And that led me to look at science, and then that spiraled pretty quickly once I realized how much was out there from places like the U.S. government and from Princeton even. I didn't know about this when I was there, from the University of Virginia and a number of other credible places that ultimately led me to write the book. So you're right that it's only been about 2 years since I first became interested in these topics.
Fascinating. And so would you mind talking about what pods you were listening to and kind of how you fell into that? Because even the subject matter you were listening to does not really fit with, kind of what we typically associate with investment bankers and Wall Street types, of which I must confess I come from that lineage as well. But what exactly were you listening to that turned you on to this?
Okay, so the first podcast I heard, it was on a podcast called Extreme Health Radio. So it was a health podcast. And it was the next one in the queue, a woman named Laura Powers, who is a psychic and works with energies, and she was just telling her story. And I remember at the end of that episode, she described her own podcast called Healing Powers, where she interviews other people who have had similar experiences. So I remembered that and said, well, I'm looking for a new podcast to listen to when I drive to work from San Francisco down to the peninsula. So I just turned that on and would leave it on in the car. And I just remember it piqued my interest after hearing enough episodes where I became very, very interested. And then the rest is history, I guess.
Interesting. I think that's one of the great things about the proliferation of podcasters now. At least here in LA, it seems like everyone has a podcast and everyone's asking each other to come on to their podcasts. And I'm probably guilty of that as well. But this is, part of the impact that it's having on society. Cool. So was there any particular piece of data that started to really convince you that maybe this materialist view of the world wasn't kind of accurate?
I'm often asked if there was one thing that kind of tipped me, and I view it more as a gradual process where I'd hear something and it would push me away from my old world view of materialism, and then I'd kind of forget about it and go back. And then I reached a point where I saw enough of this other evidence that I couldn't reconcile my old worldview with it. But that said, I think there were probably events and pieces of information that pushed me more than others. And some were actually personal experiences of weird coincidences that I couldn't reason as much that they were random. But also I experimented working with different psychics and energy workers like over the phone sessions because I was researching, and I'm like, okay, well then some people should be able to do something that I can't explain, and there were people that could do things that I couldn't explain. So it was just confirming the research that I was doing.
All right, interesting.
All makes sense.
Would you care to elaborate on any of that? I'm intrigued.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the best examples because there's so many. Okay, so this was a good one. This was with a medically focused medium. So she sees things, but medically. Okay. So we did a phone call, and she didn't know anything about me. And a few weeks before I called her, I had an irritation, I think from shaving around my jawline. Okay, and I'd forgotten about it because it went away. She, on the phone, one of the first things she says is like, I need you to go in front of the mirror. And she had me point to the exact location where I had that irritation, and I wasn't sure what it was. And she was like, yeah, it's some kind of inflammation thing. But I'm like pointing, I'm looking in front of the mirror, and this woman has never even seen me, nor could she have looked something like that up. And of all things to say, to have me point in the exact location. So when you combine that with many others, it made sense. I'm like, okay, something's up.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And so the evidence you've compiled in the book really is exhaustive, and it kind of runs the gamut from precognition to remote viewing to psychokinesis to near-death experience. To me, the problem with changing people's minds about this has not been lack of evidence. It's really kind of more been the idealist worldview seems to be held to a different scientific standard than other theories. Would you tend to agree with that, or do you think there's some other reason why the overwhelming data hasn't really been accepted, or even given proper, even given a proper hearing, really?
Yeah, I ask myself this every day. I think this alternative worldview that puts consciousness in a central role is one that is counterintuitive to our day-to-day experience, and particularly an experience that's biased by our eyes. Yeah. And I think we are just anchored to that. So to move away from things, from what our ordinary perceptions teach us, is difficult. So that's number one. And then I think separately, I would say that part of what I'm trying to do in the book is definitely to open the scientific community up. I know many have tried, and we'll see if I'm successful or not. Yeah. But beyond that, I think there's a whole body of people who are kind of like me 2+ years ago, who just hadn't been exposed to any of the information. And I'm not talking about people who are heads of science. These are just maybe people who are on Wall Street, or people who are athletes, just people who have never been exposed. Yeah. And I think that group of people could be very opened up to alternative possibilities because they might not have this standard that seems quite ridiculous. And I'll give an example. Dr. Jessica Utz, who I mentioned in my book.
The statistician.
The 2016 president of the American Statistics Association. So I'm putting my business hat on and saying, like, if this woman is saying something, she's credible in that field. Yeah. In 1995, she was commissioned by CIA, by the CIA in the U.S. and Congress to look at psychic phenomena because there was a program that had been going on. What she says in her report to Congress and the CIA is, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. Yeah. This is your point. We've used the standards applied to any other area of science, and yet it has not been accepted. Right.
Yeah. So, the evidence for the phenomena is, there's all sorts of 4 and 8 sigma events, and just kind of for the layman. So, like a 6 sigma event would indicate an odds against chance of something like 1 billion to 1. So, highly improbable that these observed phenomena are due to chance. But it seems like nobody is willing to accept it, or one of the main reasons why some of the skeptics won't accept it is because the mechanism for which these phenomena occur cannot be explained, which is not really a fair standard because there are other theories out there that are not held to that standard, and yet they're pretty broadly accepted, or at least have gained a lot of currency within the scientific community.
Right, and even things that we accept in the mainstream, that we accept them as being real and we have no understanding for how they work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many diseases, cancer, we don't understand how some of these things work.
Yeah.
Yawning, there are all kinds of bodily functions that we accept as being real and we don't yet understand the mechanism.
Yeah.
And I think in many areas, we first understand that something is real, and then we move to understanding how it could be real. And for some reason in this area, it has not worked that way yet.
Yeah. And, some of the folks that you point out, I guess I'll pick one because I listen to his podcast, but Sam Harris, for instance, who I think is a really sharp guy and makes a lot of good points and is worth listening to, and is actually a proponent, from what I can gather, of consciousness being fundamental. Yet at the same time, there are these kind of, what to me seem like internal inconsistencies in some of his arguments where he's out to debunk some folks like Eben Alexander and his near-death experience. And one of the ways that he does it, which you point out, is that by the very fact that Eben Alexander remembered his experience, that in and of itself must be evidence for his brain being turned on. I mean, do you sort of agree with that argument?
Right, I don't personally agree with that. It's a circular form of logic.
Right,
where he's saying that, well, the brain produces consciousness. I already know that. He's taking that as a given. And
yes.
Given the fact that there was a memory, it must indicate that the brain was on.
Right, right. Yeah. So there's a lot of that you run into. And so that's just kind of, I think, one good example to point out.
Yeah. What I'm trying to do is to just expose people to the fact there are multiple sides to this. There are some very smart people like Sam Harris, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Hawking.
Yeah.
Very, very smart people who have differing opinions on this.
Right.
So it's not to say that these individuals are not intelligent and they're not contributing. It's just that, like in any area of science, we have debates and certain people are on different sides of it, and it's a matter of getting the ideas out.
Yep. And lots of these folks, I think, actually argue in more or less good faith as well. In most cases, I guess. I won't digress too much from that. But one of the other things that you highlight that I think is interesting and important, in cases involving the manipulation of the random number generator, for instance, you talk about how the researchers emphasized the importance of mindset in terms of the study participants' ability to impact the random number generators. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, number one, it's an area that we need to explore further to understand what makes someone more or less able to have an impact on physical matter. And one of the observations that the researchers from Princeton have made is that it seems like when people are relaxing almost, they're better able to do it. And maybe at first they're doing well, but then they start overthinking it and then their performance goes down. Yeah. So even within this field of mental abilities beyond what we can physically see, there are variations and then there are factors that we don't fully understand. And this is really what I'm trying to get at, and what I think others are too, is to say, let's accept that these phenomena are real so that we can start studying them and understand the nuances and how we can apply them to our lives.
Yeah. I actually thought that was interesting personally, because having dabbled with PK myself, psychokinesis, like you do find that when you're trying too hard or trying to, do it, it doesn't work so well. I mean, whether it's trying to bend spoons or lighting a light bulb, when you're relaxed and you're kind of playing with it a little bit, that's when things tend to open up and happen. And so it was interesting to see it borne out in some of the data. And then one of the other things that you point out, again, kind of sticking with the importance of mindset here and really the quality of consciousness, is that with people that have experienced near-death states, critics of these folks often, point to, lack of oxygen in the brain or delusion or something along those lines. But most of these folks actually present as being hyper-rational.
Yeah, it's if you had asked me again 2+ years ago, I would have said, isn't the near-death experience just a hallucination? The brain is creating some kind of a pleasant state to compensate for the fact that you're about to die. Yeah. Right? There are all kinds of reasons that we could come up with that are theories, but it becomes very difficult to argue that when people are having non-hallucinatory memories during the time that their brain is either off or highly impaired. So there's often an argument of, well, the experience is happening. Yes, we agree that people are describing these things, but we can't prove that it happened exactly when the brain was off. Mm-hmm. Number one, there have been some studies. For example, Dr. Sam Parnia's 2014 study in the Resuscitation Journal, there was one of his the subjects in particular who was in cardiac arrest who described very specific things that were time-stamped as being during the time he was in cardiac arrest and when his brain should have been off, number one. But even if we say, well, maybe there's some residual firing in the brain that is allowing these experiences to happen, even that is really problematic for the conventional view of the brain, because in order to produce something so lucid as what is described, we would expect much more brain functioning than something that is currently hidden to our modern tools. Mm-hmm. So I don't really buy that argument either. It seems most likely that what's happening is that we are opening up in the near-death experience to some broader reality or dimension that is typically filtered out by our brain.
Yep. And what do you think of the kind of overall argument around, brain function or, these enhanced states being correlated with increased brain activity versus reduced brain activity?
Right, and this is a point Dr. Bernardo Kastrup has made many times,
yep,
where we see a reduction in brain activity that is correlated with heightened or enriched conscious experience. So the near-death experience is one. You've got a brain that's either off or almost off, and you have an enriched experience that people call realer than real.
Yeah.
Psychedelics, very similar. In a 2012 study, there was reduced brain activity in subjects who took psilocybin, which is the psychoactive chemical in magic mushrooms. So people were taking the psychedelic, they were having a psychedelic trip, and there was reduced brain functioning associated with heightened experience. There are a number of other cases. Savants are another example. They have impaired brains, and yet they have extraordinary abilities in other ways, memory, mathematics. So this matches with the idea that the brain is like a filtering mechanism, and that by closing the brain down a bit more or making it less active, we are somehow exposing ourselves to a broader reality that we normally filter out.
Right. This is actually, I think, a somewhat old argument that Aldous Huxley actually made originally in Doors of Perception, and it seems that the data is now starting to bear that out, that the brain actually acts as a reducing valve for this kind of larger consciousness system or experience that we can gain access to.
It's a really important point, because I think I would have said 2+ years ago, and many people say, well, don't we know that there's a relationship between the brain and consciousness? Doesn't it mean that consciousness comes from the brain? Like you take a psych medication and people have a change in the way that they feel.
Yeah.
They get in a car accident and then they lose their memory. Like we already know that the brain is producing it?
Yeah.
All we know is that there is a correlation. There's a relationship between the brain and consciousness. And what you just described of this reduction in brain activity is placing the brain in a different role as a filter rather than a producer.
Right. And as any good finance guy knows, correlation is not causation.
I think the history books are going to look back at this one and say, oh my goodness, they just assumed causation.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just kind of implicit in many of the arguments in support of materialism. Fascinating. So out of all the data that you've compiled in this book, do you have any favorites? I mean, I know that you talk about kind of the bundle of sticks metaphor, where it's, and you sort of already touched upon this earlier, that it wasn't kind of a single thing that changed your mind. It was the accumulation of the evidence, kind of building this thesis brick by brick. But do you have any favorites out of these bricks or sticks?
I do. I'm going to mention those, but the sticks argument is a really important one, and that's the reason I felt comfortable writing this book, is that we can make controversy over any particular study or meta-analysis, but when you put them all together, I think it becomes unreasonable to conclude without evidence that each study is fraudulent or that someone was lying. So it's the accumulation of evidence that I think makes it so powerful, even though there's powerful evidence individually. And so if someone asked me to say, hey, Mark, you have 2 minutes, tell me the best evidence, I like to start with the CIA documents that have been recently declassified. They talk about remote viewing. So this is a U.S. government program for more than 20 years where they use psychic spies to use their minds to view something remotely. So meaning they're not there and they're seeing things with their eyes, remote viewing.
So this is Stargate.
Stargate. And it's been called a number of different names. There's controversy over did remote viewing, was it proven or not?
Yeah.
There are documents that have been recently declassified, and I will give you a direct quote from the document. Remote viewing is a real phenomenon.
Yep.
So I don't know what the counter to that is.
Yeah, and so this is a Department of the Army document, right? I believe that was the institution that commissioned this study, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I downloaded it directly from the CIA's website. It's completely flat. It says, evidence too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence.
Mm-hmm. And so some of the folks that were participating in this study, you actually reference in your book, like Joe McMoneagle, Russell Targ, I think, was also associated with it, Ingo Swann, maybe. But these are all preeminent remote viewers, psychic spies, and that is probably my single favorite data point as well. Very cool. So in terms of changing belief systems, you make the argument that funding more research is unlikely to change minds, because again, we already have a plethora of 4 to 8 Sigma studies. And I tend to agree with that. The evidence is already overwhelming. But in keeping with this bundle of sticks idea, is it your hope that by compiling all the evidence in one place that you might persuade people through what is essentially a meta-analysis, right? It's an analysis of analyses.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's my aim. I think that was partially my aim. Another aim was to expose people to these ideas who have never heard of them. I mean, I had never heard of remote viewing before. I didn't know what that was. There are a lot of very smart people in the world today that have never even heard of these things. So I think exposure is step one, to know, hey, these things have been alleged to exist, and this is the evidence that's been out there. But beyond that, in terms of trying to shift minds to the extent that that can happen, I do think that this meta-analysis approach, at least for me, that's the way my mind works, where I have a hard time breaking the bundle when you have that many sticks. I can break any one stick, maybe. When you put them together, I think it's difficult to do. So I guess we'll find out if it's successful.
And so are you a proponent of funding study to try to better understand the mechanism by which these phenomena happen?
Totally. I'm a proponent of studying everything in this area, because I think it's a whole area of science that's being swept under the rug, and we don't know the kinds of advances we'll find, whether it's continuing to prove that certain phenomena are real, even though I think we already have, or just understanding the mechanisms and how that might relate to many things.
So what if that's not findable, though? Do you think that places an undue burden on the idealist position that some other positions, I don't know, like say the many universes thesis, like doesn't have to support? Like no one's trying to find the mechanism, right?
I think it does. I think it does. I think it's worth a while to try, but I think it's an undue burden. But on this point of idealism, and again, Bernardo Castro makes this point extremely well in his work, the most skeptical position metaphysically we can take is an idealist position, because all we can actually ever know is something that's within consciousness. Anything that exists outside of anyone's consciousness is by definition not provable, because we need to consciously experience something to fully prove its existence. So it's so ironic to me that the most skeptical position is the one that is being resisted most by a community that would argue that it's skeptical.
Yeah, it's actually the position that you can find something outside of consciousness is actually the one that requires the leap of faith.
Exactly. To presume that anything exists outside of consciousness is by definition not provable. And Albert Einstein, as I mentioned in my book, he acknowledged this when he was debating someone around 1930. He said, I cannot prove that my conception is right, meaning materialism, but that is my religion. In other words, he acknowledged there's a leap of faith. I just think there's something outside of consciousness, even though I could never prove it.
Yeah. And so there's an example of a really smart guy. And he was actually bothered quite a bit by some of the things that were happening with quantum mechanics at the time, which he called spooky action at a distance.
That's right. Yeah,
great minds have struggled with this.
Yes, because like we discussed earlier, it's counterintuitive, and counterintuitive things can be disturbing, but we live in a reality that we are learning more and more is not in line with our common sense. So it's hard to kind of shut off our common sense mind and say, wait, other things are possible.
Yeah, one of the great quotes that I think you had in the book, and it was, I think, your own words, and I'm probably going to bungle it here, but something along the lines of, we perceive reality to be linear and Newtonian, basically, and it's actually the opposite. It's nonlinear and non-local, and that is very hard to get your head around.
Right. The way I describe it, this is in chapter 3, we view reality to be linear, Newtonian, and fixed.
Yeah.
Whereas, in fact, it's nonlinear, quantum, and relativistic.
Yep.
And we know that that's not even a controversial statement, I think. I think science would acknowledge that that's true.
Right. When it comes to our everyday reality, though, or our everyday experience, it's very difficult to come to grips with that. And one of the really interesting studies that you called out in the book, maybe my second or third favorite data point here, is the people that were studying for an exam and had improved results, which you would expect if you study for an exam. But what was weird about it is they studied for the exam after taking the exam, right? Or that's essentially the study, right?
Right. So basically the future is having an effect on the past.
Right.
And this is something we see in a number of phenomena. Again, highly controversial if you mention this to anyone in the mainstream. But when you combine the results from studies like that and also studies where people are looking at an image, but they don't know what image will be coming up, and yet their body's responding seconds before, it is suggesting almost that consciousness is reaching forward in time, which actually makes sense under this alternative perspective where consciousness is beyond space and time. And now we're somehow empirically able to pick it up, whether it's through performance based on future studying or if it's a future picture that is shown.
Right, and so this stuff doesn't compute, and it sounds kind of crazy. And when researchers submit this to respected journals for peer review, they don't want to touch it. And that is kind of part of what we're up against here.
Yes, although I will say, and I mentioned this in chapter 1, I'm so glad the study came out before before the book went to print. But there's a study in the American Psychologist Journal, which is the official peer-reviewed journal of the American Psychological Association, by Dr. Etzel Cardenia, which looks at meta-analyses for all these types of phenomena, for precognition, remote viewing, telepathy, etc. And they published the article. And it acknowledges that there is an effect here. It's a big deal.
That's great to hear, and that is a very big deal. And so this is all come together very rapidly for you. So you were kind of first introduced to this, what you call groundbreaking science in the summer of 2016, and here we are in kind of the fall of 2018. And you've not only changed your mind, you've written a book on this. So this obviously must be very important to you personally. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most significant implication to bringing about this, what you call an end to upside-down thinking?
I would say there are many implications, but the most significant to me is the way that it can shift one's outlook. And the reason I decided to write a book was that I started to tell friends about this information, and they told me that the impact it had on them was very positive, and especially over time as the ideas sunk in. I mean, sometimes it would be having a dinner, and people would say, Mark, I think about those studies you told me at dinner, and I can't get them out of my head. Right. That's what led me to sit down and try to write the book. And I actually sat down over 4th of July weekend in 2017, which was a 4-day weekend, and wrote more than half the book that weekend. I basically just did my inner investment banker style, just my apartment, books everywhere, cranked
up all night. Yeah, okay.
As much as I could, I couldn't do what I used to do in investment banking. I had to go to sleep for a few hours, but I was going nonstop. And then I finished it over the next few weekends. So you're right, this was extremely rapid. I came out of July 2017 with a book with no prior plans of ever writing something.
Wow. And so in terms of the change in worldview that this can bring about in people, would you say it's similar to what some NDEers report in terms of being less materialistic, less competitive, less fearful of death, having some greater concern for others and for, an appreciation for life or a sense of purpose? Is that kind of what you're talking about, or?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think many people have a lingering fear of death, whether it's just under the surface or explicit. And what we're talking about here is the notion that the physical body and the physical life is just a speck within a broader spectrum of existence, and that the consciousness that we have does not die when our body dies. So for many people, that can be a major relief. For some people, they've said, well, actually, that's not relieving because now what I'm doing matters. So that's more of a burden.
No, that's a fair point as well. Great. I see. So you've still got a day job. I mean, you're still an iBanker. How are people receiving this in your world?
I would say it's still new, and I'm
Yeah.
waiting to find
New.
out.
All right.
We'll see as more and more people read it. I mean, as of the recording date, the book's only been out for a week and a half.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's awesome. I appreciate what you're doing. I think it's probably the best collection of evidence all gathered in one place that I've seen. I hope you folks go check it out. It's called An End to Upside Down Thinking by Mark Gober. You can check it out where in bookstores near you, Amazon. You have a preferred location?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and bookstores near you. Also, my website, which is just my name, markgober.com, has more information on my book. And also, I will be coming out with my own podcast, which, similar to yours, Garrett, I'm interviewing many people. Like I've interviewed Bernardo Kastrup and Dean Radin and many of the people I talk about in my book. So hopefully that'll be out in a few months.
Cool. We'll look for that as well. So hope this helped. If you guys found it interesting or worthwhile, please give us a like, share it up. We'll talk to you next time. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Garrett.